Hello friends, welcome to the Playground Podcast. It's me, Shanila, and today we are revisiting the witch wound. Ooh, creepy, scary. So this is a follow-up to an episode I made a few years ago, which I highly recommend you listen to, episode 32. And basically, I'm feeling inspired to upgrade that conversation or to kind of add on to the conversation. So I don't really want to repeat everything that's in that episode. I really want you to listen to the Witch Wound, episode 32. But there is this new inspiration that I have around this topic. And mainly it's coming from the fact that most recently I've been holding space for a few different containers. A mentorship container, which is all about perfectionism. I also have an embodiment container, all about embodiment, and there's overlap between what we're doing in these two spaces. And of course, I train healing arts practitioners, so I have a couple of sound healers that I'm working with, and we have our Flow Breathwork Facilitator certification program that we're holding space for as well. So as you can see, I'm kind of in this season where there's a lot of people in my midst. I'm not always in this season. Sometimes I'm just minding my own business and doing my own thing, but sometimes I'm like, yes, I have the energy for these containers. So when I have the energy, I'm like in it. So with that, there's this inspiration that comes when we are often revisiting the same topics over and over again. And this concept of the witch wound is something that is so important. It's a potent conversation, but oftentimes it's something that we are not really aware that we're functioning under. So long story short, because I still do want you to listen to the episode 32 called The Witch Wound. It's on this podcast, the Playground Podcast. But I also want to mention to you that the short version of what a witch wound is that back in the day, the word witch meant wise woman. And it wasn't this creepy, scary old lady in the woods luring in children and doing, malicious, witchy activities all by themselves with warts on their hands and faces. It wasn't this character that sometimes we think about when we think about witches. And even as I'm talking about this, I have the image of Snow White, Snow White, the Disney movie, and you see the witch in the woods, and she's bringing the apple, the poison, and she's envious of this little girl's beauty and blah blah blah. There's this competition energy that is associated with witch, or that they're doing something malicious or malvoyant or something along those lines. But back in the day, the witch was the wise woman. The word witch meant wise woman, and essentially these women were the ones who were super in tuned to nature. They were connected to earth, so they were the ones who were in the dirt planting. They were growing food. They were building gardens. They were making things out of resources from the earth. They were grounding. They were, using their hands in soil and dirt. These were the people who were using water for resources. They were using the air. They were using the moon. They were using the sunlight. They were using fire. There was such a ceremonial element to that, even as I'm saying, it sounds so romanticized. Maybe the people who were practicing it weren't romanticizing it. It was just a matter of fact how they lived their lives. But people back in the day were just a little bit more connected to the natural rhythms of life. They were just a little bit more in tune to acknowledging and working with what is naturally there. So long story short, basically what happens is that we experience imperialism, we experience colonialism, we experience settlers coming into indigenous spaces and tribal spaces who tend to remove some of these cultural contexts or these indigenous connections to earth or to elements or to nature or to the natural rhythms of life. So we see this translate throughout history in a lot of different ways. We have people who come into an entire country or an entire tribe, and they basically remove the way of life. They remove the fact that these people in the society, they were using these plants as medicine, or they were using these things to help them go to sleep, or they were using these, concoctions in order to meditate or to do a spiritual practice, or they were using this practice for birthing or post-birthing, or things like, scabs and wounds. There were all these, traditional medicines that were intuitively concocted over time, and these were passed down by oral tradition. So people were not writing it down. These were passed down by, oral history. So, your great grandmother would pass it down to your grandmother would pass it down to your mom would pass it down to you would pass it down. Like, it was passed down that way. So what tended to happen is that in the societies where we had a lot of, connection to nature, and even things like, the moon, and, nowadays in Western culture, like, oftentimes people make fun of like the astrology girls or the people who talk about the moon. But you know what? Like, the moon was used for many different reasons. And if you study different animal behaviors or fertility patterns, you're going to start to notice that the moon has a rhythm to many of these animals' cycles. It's connected to a way that certain fish come out to spawn, or certain animals and insects come out to breed, and women's menstruation cycles are often synced with the moon as well. And we have, people who work with the water, meaning sailors and folks on boats and folks in canoes. They would utilize the moon for navigation, because that's how they would be able to dictate the tides. That's how they would be able to tell like the safe passages. That's how they would be able to tell time, and it's like, it's amazing that we have more modern tools, if you will, like, more, okay, it's great that we created a compass, that's great, so it's nice that we don't have to look at the sky to do this or that thing. And it's nice that we have other tools like, modern medicine and, care and science, and it has evolved in a certain way. But science also used to exist back then too. And so for these people who were tuned into the natural rhythms and the natural things, these were the witches. So these were the wisdom keepers. These were the knowledge holders. And basically what happened, and as I mentioned, as imperialism and colonialism and a lot of the movement from the natural to the synthetic started to happen, what they started to do is discredit the people who held this indigenous knowledge, the tribal knowledge, the land knowledge, the wisdom keepers. So they were just like, okay, well, where's your proof? You know what I mean? It's like, well, like, where's the science? Like, where's the empirical? Like, and there's value and proof, and there's value in evidence, there's value in science, but also science basically just means study through observation. So many of these people have studied certain things like yoga and Ayurveda and breathing techniques, and being able to do herbology and the mixing of ingredients and things like that for thousands of years. That was passed on orally or by tradition within these groups. And so when people came to settle these places, they were just like, we don't understand why you're talking to plants, or we don't understand why you're like worshiping the moon. We don't get it. So they basically eradicated and erased that type of history, and basically ostracized the folks who were kind of doing weird shit, if you will, right? Like, it's like, all right, you talk to the moon, cool story, bro. You know what I mean? It was kind of just like ostracized. And so of course, like, over time, it became harder and harder for people to hold on to traditional practices and traditional way of life, and it's not to say that there's nothing wrong with evolving your way of life as it's relevant to modern day. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't want to travel in a canoe to this place or that place. Like, I like the convenience of a train or a car or a bicycle. Like, I like those things. But it's to say that when we have such a disconnect between what we were able to experience in synergy with the land versus feeling like talking and cultivating a relationship with the land is such a foreign concept. So if I just place that there, right? Like, if we just place that idea there, that the wise woman, and for the most part, and this is not true for every single place in the world, of course, but a lot of these places had a matriarchal presence. These were the women who were the wisdom keepers. So these were the elders often of the tribe, or the elders of the village, or elders of the community. And you can still see traces of this in a lot of culture, even if they won't associate or identify themselves as witches, right? Like, there's so many different connotations, and even religious connotations of being like a witch or whatever, but essentially it's just the wisdom keeper, you know, like the people who keep the information. So oftentimes you'll see this in like farming communities or indigenous, you know, tree communities or land back communities. You'll see this in fishing communities. You'll see this in a lot of different places where it's like, no, we are in tune to the rhythm and the nature of the water, or in tune to the nature of the seasons, or in tune to the, right? Like there's all these different things to keep account of that give you information, right? And we're a little bit disconnected from that. So I digress from that conversation, but essentially what we're saying in terms of why this witch wound is like resurfacing for a lot of people, especially if you're somebody who's in the healing arts, somebody who's a healer, a coach, a nurse, a doula, a wellness practitioner, you're somebody who's adjacently in the healing arts, you might be starting to feel this resurfacing of this witch wound that doesn't actually belong to you. So basically what I'm saying is that when this ostracization started to happen, we had ancestors who had to essentially hide the fact that they were doing, you know, talking to earth and talking to the birds and talking to the plant. They had to pretend like they were not doing this, because the repercussions of being somebody who was doing that is that they will call you a witch, and that was not like thought to be the wise woman. That was like, oh, you're a witch, so we're gonna ostracize you, we're gonna, you know, ridicule you, we're going to separate you from society, you know, we're gonna burn you at the stake. And there's this fear that if you are different than what you're supposed to assimilate to, then there is inherently there's inherently a consequence to pay for it, right? Like you have to pay the price if you're gonna do weird shit. And that has been true in like many different things, right? Like sometimes it is not like you're the plant person. Sometimes it's just like, oh, you want to study something different, right? And you feel ostracized. You feel like, oh my gosh, everybody in my family studies, you know, law, but I want to study plants, or everybody in my family studies accounting, or they're doctors, or they're this or that, but I want to study, you know, woodworking, or I want to study something that is like, you know, not necessarily in the lines of conforming to what is thought to be like a productive member of society. Not that I'm saying like woodworking and art and plants are not productive part. I'm just saying like the thought process from how we got here. Oftentimes these types of careers, or careers that seem like not relevant to living, like why would you study plants, or why would you study that, or why would you do this, or why would you, you know, like develop this skill set? Why would you want to, you know, strengthen your intuition? Why would you want to, you know, try mentalism and try to, you know, see about your psychic powers? Like they're not valued like they used to be in the past, right? And so part of it is this awareness that we have that we might be holding on to a wound that our ancestors experienced. So there might have been some ancestors in your lineage, and maybe you even have access to some living members of the family that you can ask, like, hey, did I have a grandma or did I have a grandfather? Because it's not necessarily like gender specific, even though we are saying like the women and the matriarchal line and the lineage are more influenced by this. Men are not uninfluenced by this, right? Like there is a cohesive relationship between both parties and any other parties involved that's how we got here. And so you might ask somebody in your family, like, hey, were there any plant people, or were there any, you know, like bird people, or were there any, and you might be surprised that there might be some aunt or somebody in your family that you're not really aware of, or it's like a distant aunt or something like that, who has like this odd hobby, or they, you know, like have this collection of birds, or they have this collection of books, or they, you know, they do this in kind of secrecy. So one of the ways to know that you are experiencing the witch wound is that you feel like you're doing things in secrecy. And it's not because you're doing something like bad, you know what I mean? Like you're not actually doing like an illegal thing or whatever. You're doing something that's like generally not bad, but you feel like it is. There's some kind of guilt or shame associated with it, or sometimes it's the fear of doing the thing because you don't know how it's going to be perceived by others, and especially perceived by people you love. You know, it might be your family, it might be your friends, it might be your partner, and you're like, I don't want to talk about the fact that I'm exploring this. I don't want to talk about the fact that I'm actually into it. I don't want to talk about it. And so there's kind of this like hiding, there's a secrecy, there's a part of you that says like, I can't really put it out there, because me putting it out there means that I have to put myself at the risk of being ostracized, right? Like somebody might say something that's going to hurt my feelings, and we're always like trying not to get our feelings hurt, right? So we evade, being out there. We evade talking about the things that we're genuinely interested in. We evade a lot of things. This avoidance behavior is a very natural thing for you to do, but essentially what it does is that it keeps you in hiding, okay? The second way the witch wound can be showing up for you is that you feel just really lonely and isolated. It just feels like you're the first one who's doing this work in your family, and you're the first one who's ever, tried, and you're breaking generational, patterns and habits, and you're the first one who's like saying that you have an interest in it. So it can feel incredibly isolating, okay? So I do want to acknowledge that for you right off the bat, that it can, okay? But I also want to give you hope that you're probably not the first person in your family or your family line who's had this thought. You know what I mean? And it's that you might be the only one who is actively acting upon it in the present moment. But there might have been a family member who tried to in their younger years, but they got shut down because they thought that it was safer to be in hiding than to come out with their interest in the healing arts. Or somebody said something to them that detracted them, or they never really put it out there because they were like, I'm just going to stay hiding because that's just the safest option for me. So it's not that nobody tried, it's that you just don't have the evidence that they did or didn't. You know what I mean? So you start to believe like you're the only one. And part of healing through the witch wound is to say that, how can I look at people that I love and also see about them what it is that I see about me? And if I am the one who's wanting to share my gifts, and I want to be the one to show up, and I want to be the one to heal myself so that I can help others, can I see that reflected in my parents? Can I see that reflected in my brother? Can I see that reflected in my sister? Can I see that reflected in my cousin? And if you truly see it from that lens, you're going to see that you're not alone. You're just the one who's being brave about this right now, and this is a really great position for you to be in, because one way is that you give into your fear and then you do nothing about it. But I'm going to make a guess, and this is a projection of my own, because I want you to be on this other path, which is that, if you're listening to an episode about the witch wound, you're ready to heal through that. And healing through the witch wound is, at the end of the day, permission. And it's not permission from me. Maybe you're inspired by listening to me to give yourself permission. Of course, then, yay, cool. And it's not permission from your parents. It's not permission from the people you love. It's not an external permission. It is a self-permission to say, it's okay for me to be seen. All right. And so the witch wound basically is a survival tactic and a survival mechanism that many of our ancestors picked up in order to save themselves, so they didn't want to talk about all this kind of stuff, because it's like, all right, well, somebody's literally going to murder them, or somebody's literally going to ostracize them. And you hear about all of these different types of, oppressive things that have happened to different societies in terms of separating people from their culture, right? There's residential schools, there's genocide, there's so many different ways that oppression has taken place. And so even if you in this specific moment are not at the risk of like your culture being taken away from you, your family, your ancestors might have assimilated to a particular culture in order to not be the outsider. They didn't want it to be othered. They didn't want to be the, the people over there doing the weird shit over there, doing this kind of thing, when like everybody else is trying to kind of like fit in order to not be ostracized. Okay. And you can also see this happening in the history of the United States, right? Like there's lots of different things that were erased in this culture that now we're like, okay, indigenous people, we need help with these forests. We need help with the land. We need help with the water. We need help because like there's a synergistic relationship that used to take place. And a side rant that I'll say is, if we look at the Amazon and the Amazon forest, like these were planted by people. These are not natural things that were there. These are cultivated things that there's rain in the rainforest because people planted plants here, and they planted it in very specific ways so that there's layers of protection. So there's like an upper layer, there's a middle layer, there's a ground layer. And all of these layers serve a different purpose, therefore the preservation of the forest as a whole. So you're not going to just like plant invasive species here. You're going to plant something that is going to protect the top layer. And then there's another layer for birds, and there's another layer for animals. There's another layer for people. There's very specific ways that this was done. And because it's a sustainable forest, the water from the ground goes up into the sky, and then that creates rain, and then the rain comes down, and then the water from the ground goes back up to the sky. That's literally how rain works, right? So like they literally created rain clouds above the forest in order to have a synergistic relationship. But then when we talk about the Americas, and I mean there's so many different parts of the world that we can talk about, but if we talk about the Americas, we start to notice that when the settlers came here, when the colonizers came, they basically just, took from the people who had a relationship with the land. They said, erase, erase, erase. And now, we're like, oh, okay, should we plant trees? Should we have done that? Right. So we're just backtracking in a lot of ways. So yes, let me retract my tangent here, which is to say that, this witch wound, if it is showing up for you in the two ways that I mentioned, which is one, that you're feeling like you're going into hiding or you are in hiding, and two, that you feel like there is such an isolation or loneliness to that, understand that this is part of the process. Understand that if you've identified that, then you're able to work through it. Where I would be concerned is if you were just like, oh, I really can't just pinpoint why I can't be out here sharing my gifts and shining my light and putting myself out there and to really be doing the things that I want to be doing. Whether, I often talk in the context of the healing arts because I mainly work with healers, but then I also want to point out like this could just be about life in general too. Sometimes you want to do a hobby or you want to have you have a passion for something, but you just don't feel like you can put it out there, or you want to dress a certain way, or you want to, right? Like you just feel like there's this judgment. So the witch wound can show up in different things in your life as well that are outside of just this idea of, like, ooh, it has to be the healing arts and it has to be, some kind of relevant thing there. So one of the things that I love about the witch wound, and especially, I'm thinking about the first time I made a version of this episode, and it was probably like 3 years ago, maybe 3.5 years ago. And so I noticed the change within myself as I'm talking about the witch wound as well, right? So I had a particular context back then, and as I've done my own, exploration and personal growth through this concept, I also noticed like, oh my goodness, the witch wound shows up in a different way, because I feel just way more embodied in my practice than I did 3 years ago. And hopefully 3 years from now, I'll be more embodied, and then 3 years, right? Like there's always going to be an evolution. So I'm not like knocking myself 3 years ago and be like, oh my gosh, what? That's not the vibe I'm ever in. But I'm also just like reflecting on like, yeah, it really pays off, this ability to acknowledge that, yes, I am in this position where I'm feeling like I'm being called to step up and step out, and I'm being called to share. I'm being called to, start a business, or I'm being called to do this thing or that thing. There is value and benefit in going through the trouble of doing that. And in retrospect, you've done this before already. It just feels different because you forget the past, right? Like you forget like how many times you've done something where you felt like you were the only one doing it, but you did it, And so it's worthwhile to kind of acknowledge those things for yourself so that you can say, I have evidence of me being brave, and I have evidence of me being able. I have evidence of me, doing X, Y, and Z different things. And part of the exploration of the witch wound, which really, really helps, is if you are able to get into a practice where you can connect with your ancestors. And I truly mean this, I really, really mean this, because this witch wound, as I said, didn't just appear with you. It was passed down from people who felt fear in being seen or fear of putting themselves out there because they were going to be ostracized. So for example, if it was your great-great-great-great-grandmother who, for some circumstance, was experiencing oppression or war or survival or whatever the situation was, where she could not have fully been in her light, whether it was not allowed, whether it was dangerous, whether it was physically dangerous, whether, there was going to be violence if she were to do certain things in a certain way, she may have trained her daughter to also, not be seen, right? Like be seen but not heard, or don't be heard, don't be seen. Like it goes in so many different directions. And so it's like, yeah, just be quiet and do as you're told so that you're not causing the noise. And so then that daughter passed it on to the daughter to say like, yeah, you should be seen and not heard. You should not be like causing all these troubles. You should just like know your place here. And then that was passed down. And so even though you are removed, or you might be removed from like the immediate threat of somebody, like oppressing you or like othering you, you might still have some subconscious programming that was passed down by people who also had subconscious programming passed down by them. And so now you look at it and you're like, that's just how it is. That's just how my family is, but that's just the way it was. Like, that's just how we do it. Like, that's just my culture. That's my society. But if you look far back enough, you'll start to notice that it wasn't always like that. Like, everybody was not like always like scared and oppressed. Like, there was a sense of freedom. It got trained into a certain way. We got trained to be a certain way in order to not cause a ruckus. And so in this moment, while you're experiencing and exploring the witch wound, it's so important to connect to ancestors. And I don't mean that you need like a specific energy to connect to, and you're like, oh, it needs to be my, third removed grandfather or grandmother on this side or that side. You literally don't need that information. And especially if you're somebody who might be disconnected from your family tree for whatever reason, there's plenty of reasons why you might not have access to that. You don't need a specific person. You're just connecting to the energy of that. So basically a breathwork practice or a meditation practice, and if you are really getting into a flow breathwork practice where you're moving your body in order to connect to the energies of these ancestors. And basically what you're going to start to notice is that these ancestors are really funny, because they'll literally like ask you, why are you taking it so seriously? And they'll laugh at you and just be like, yeah, go study that, or go do that, or like, we're on your side. Like, you have the freedom, we didn't have that freedom. You have the luxury. Like, what the hell? You have internet, like you have this at the palm of your hands. Like, what the heck is social media? Like, you can do that, you know what I mean? And you have teachers out here. Like, we didn't have all of this connection, and they're going to be so excited for you. Like, this is my spoiler alert, and I am like projecting, but this is a spoiler alert that your ancestors are like literally rooting for you. And oftentimes I say like certain people's ancestors don't need to be channeled because they were not great ancestors, but we're talking about the energy of ancestors, right? Like, even those shitty ancestors had a reason for why they behaved the way they did. They did it from survival. So if we look even a couple of steps above that, they were also experiencing some kind of survival moments in their life. That's just something that you're going to discover when you're channeling the ancestors. So it's not to say like, okay, I need to exclude these people because these were bad people in the lineage. Like, if you know that, then you know that, but tune into the energy of this like inner knowing, right? Like, the source energy is basically like these codes that get downloaded into you when you're doing flow breath work, and you're dancing, and you're moving, and you're giving offerings, and it's like a prayer, right? Like the the breath is a prayer, and you're just praying to say that, like, where am I supposed to go? Like, where am I being called to? And it's not like a physical location everywhere. So it's not like you need to move or something. Sometimes it is, you're just like being called to, but sometimes it's just like, where am I being called to share my voice? Where, at what topics am I being called to talk about? Do I want to like start a podcast about it? Do I want to explore that? Do I want to write a blog? Do I want to, be part of a community? Do I want to, go on the internet and find meetup groups or Facebook groups that are about this topic? Do I want to find a teacher? Do I want to read a book? There's like so many pathways of exploration that it's like, I don't really understand the saying, the world is your oyster. Like, I don't get the analogy, but here I am. The world is your oyster. You know what I mean? So like, you're going to get so much guidance from ancestral work in that way, where it's like, like the energy of receiving messages from ancestors is like, like, why did I overcomplicate this? Like, why did I, disconnect my inner knowing and my self intuition, like my intuition that is like in my physical body, by trying to complicate it and try to create a storyline or a situation. So, some of this is like, okay, well, how do I talk to ancestors? But like, honestly, you just ask for them. Like, just continuously ask for them, and just know that when you do hear them, in whatever form or format you hear them, because everybody's receptors and antenna are different. Some people will see them in their dreams. Some people will experience an energy. Some people will just get like a ping in their third eye. They will just have this like download, this knowing. Sometimes, the information is translated to you through a song or through somebody else's voice. But anytime you even remotely, even like 2% feel like, ooh, this is an ancestor, just say like, I heard you. I heard you. So confirming that to yourself over and over again, that you are on the right track, you are being guided. And this loneliness that we tend to feel, especially if we're doing healing work, if we're doing reprogramming, if we're like breaking through things and thought process and blah, blah, blah. It's okay to feel lonely, but if you find the evidence that you're not alone, then that's the evidence that you have to go by, because facts are facts, like statistics are statistics. Those are the numbers, right? Like, so if the numbers are there, and if you're like, whoa, ancestors talk to me like all the time through, music, or they talk to me through angel numbers, or they talk to me through, signs or animals or whatever the case may be, it's like, okay, then you don't get to keep repeating the story that you're alone. You don't get to keep saying that, because it's not true. And you shouldn't keep saying that. Okay. Well, I hope this episode helped you out. And I would love for you to subscribe to the podcast, give it a 5-star rating, of course. And if you would, share this episode with somebody that you think could benefit from it, that would be amazing. And I also want to mention that if you want to study the healing arts, you can come do that with me at www.alwaysplay.org. And I just started an Instagram channel for the Healing Arts Collective. So if you are a practitioner in the healing arts and you want to be part of this broadcast channel where I'll be sharing lots of different tips and tricks for healing arts practitioners, go ahead and join that by going to my Instagram at shanila.satar, or you can send me a DM and I can link you directly. Okie dokie. All right, friends, just remember, the world is your playground. And until next time, I will catch you soon.